At 2 in the morning, silence is never empty. It is only waiting to be broken. The street outside a closed diner in downtown Denver was nearly lifeless under a flickering streetlight, its hum casting uneven shadows across cracked pavement and faded parking lines. Standing alone beneath that light was Laura Bennett, dressed in a plain jacket and dark jeans, her posture relaxed but her attention anything but. She had the stillness of someone who did not belong to the environment, yet understood it better than anyone else present. The city around her felt distant, muffled, as if the world had narrowed down to this single stretch of concrete and artificial light. Laura checked her watch once, not out of impatience, but out of habit, then slipped her hands into her pockets, scanning reflections in the diner glass behind her without turning her head. Somewhere deeper down the street, footsteps echoed faintly, unhurried at first, then gradually converging. 6 figures emerged from the darker end of the block, their presence shifting the atmosphere before they even reached the light. They did not speak immediately, but their formation was deliberate, spreading slightly as they closed distance, creating an unspoken boundary around her position. Laura noticed each detail without moving her stance, the spacing between them, the rhythm of their steps, the way they positioned themselves to control exits without needing to announce intent. She did not step back. She did not look away. Instead, her gaze lifted just slightly, acknowledging their presence with a calm that did not match the situation most people would assume. The first of them stopped a few feet away, tilting his head as if evaluating her reaction. The others followed, forming a loose semicircle that effectively removed the possibility of easy movement in any direction. The air grew heavier with each passing second, not from noise or motion, but from expectation. Laura exhaled slowly, the only visible sign that she was acknowledging the shift in pressure around her. Her expression remained unchanged, neither inviting nor resisting, simply observing. One of the men exchanged a brief glance with another, as if confirming something unspoken. The streetlight above flickered again, briefly dimming the space between them before returning to full brightness, casting sharper edges on their silhouettes. Laura finally adjusted her stance by a fraction, shifting her weight evenly between both feet, an almost imperceptible change that suggested readiness without declaration. She looked past the nearest figure for a moment, then back, as if mapping the environment rather than engaging the confrontation. The group tightened their spacing slightly, reducing the remaining gaps of open space around her until the diner window reflected all of them together in a fractured composition of glass and light. No one had raised their voice. No one had moved aggressively. Yet the situation had already defined itself. Laura remained centered within it, quiet, composed, and fully aware that whatever followed would not be determined by words alone. The silence on the street deepened as the semicircle of figures held their positions under the flickering Denver streetlight, their presence now fully established in the space between light and shadow. Laura Bennett remained exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, but her awareness had shifted into a more focused state, as if every small environmental detail had become part of a larger pattern she was quietly reading. The diner window behind her reflected fragmented images of the group, bending their silhouettes into distorted layers of glass and light, yet her reflection remained steady in the center. One of the men took a half step forward, then stopped, as if reconsidering the distance between intention and action. No words were spoken yet, but the tension was no longer forming. It was already present, fully developed, occupying the space like a physical object. Laura's eyes moved briefly from one individual to another, not lingering, not challenging, but observing with measured attention that suggested she was categorizing rather than reacting. She reached slowly into her jacket pocket, not in a hurried motion, but with deliberate calm, and withdrew her hand without revealing anything, letting it rest again at her side. The group subtly adjusted their spacing in response, tightening the formation by instinct rather than instruction. The streetlight above flickered once more, briefly dimming the center of the scene before stabilizing, casting a stronger contrast between illuminated pavement and surrounding darkness. Laura exhaled softly, her breath visible for a moment in the cold air, then faded as quickly as it appeared. Behind the glass of the closed diner, Faint reflections of empty chairs and counter lights added to the sense of isolation, reinforcing how removed this moment was from ordinary nighttime activity. One of the men tilted his head slightly, speaking something too low to be clearly heard, and the others reacted with small shifts in stance that suggested agreement without confirmation. Laura did not respond. Instead, she adjusted her footing by a fraction of an inch, aligning her stance more evenly with the ground beneath her, a movement so subtle it could easily be missed by anyone not paying close attention. The air between them felt compressed, as if the distance had shortened without anyone physically moving closer. A passing vehicle in the far distance briefly illuminated the street before disappearing, momentarily stretching their shadows across the pavement and then pulling them back into place. Laura's gaze briefly followed the fading light, then returned forward, steady and composed. The group remained in their semicircle, maintaining control of the space without advancing further, their focus fixed on her reaction that still had not come. The environment itself seemed to hesitate, caught between escalation and pause, as if waiting for the next decision to define what kind of encounter this would become. The semicircle of figures remained locked in place under the unstable glow of the streetlight, their positions now reinforced by the silence that had stretched beyond ordinary discomfort into something more deliberate and sustained. Laura Bennett stood at the center of their focus without shifting away, her presence steady as if she had already accounted for every variable in the space around her. The diner behind her remained closed, its darkened interior reflecting fragments of the confrontation in broken layers of glass, giving the scene an almost unreal symmetry between inside and outside, light and shadow, motion and stillness. One of the men exhaled sharply, breaking the stillness for a brief instant, then quickly steadied himself as if realizing that even small sounds carried weight in the absence of movement. Laura's eyes moved again, not faster, not slower, but with deliberate continuity, scanning each individual in sequence without breaking her composed stance. There was no visible escalation in her expression, only a steady, controlled awareness that suggested she was tracking more than just physical positions. A second man shifted his feet slightly, narrowing the gap between him and the others, and the formation subtly adjusted in response, maintaining its arc around her without collapsing inward. The air felt colder now, or perhaps it was simply the stillness making every sensation more pronounced. Laura's hand remained visible at her side, relaxed but aligned with her posture, signaling neither surrender nor confrontation, only control over herself within the moment. A distant siren echoed faintly somewhere several blocks away, passing through the city like a brief reminder that the world beyond this street still functioned independently of what was unfolding here. None of the men reacted to it, their attention remaining fixed on Laura, waiting for something that had not yet arrived. The diner window reflected the group more clearly as the streetlight stabilized, showing their positions as a distorted but complete circle, with Laura at its center like a fixed point that refused to shift. She tilted her head slightly, not toward any one person, but toward the space itself, as if reassessing the geometry of the situation rather than the individuals within it. One of the men spoke quietly, his voice low enough that only fragments carried through the air, and the others responded with minimal movement, a slight tightening of stance that suggested confirmation without verbal agreement. Laura did not answer. Instead, she took a slow step sideways, no more than a few inches, repositioning herself just enough to break perfect symmetry while maintaining full awareness of the circle around her. The shift was small, but it changed the alignment of perception, forcing those watching to adjust their expectations of her response. The streetlight flickered again, casting a brief ripple of shadow across the pavement before returning to full brightness, revealing every detail with uncomfortable clarity. The group remained contained in their formation, neither advancing nor retreating, as if waiting for a threshold that had not yet been crossed. Laura's expression remained unchanged, but her focus had clearly sharpened, her attention now centered not on the individuals themselves, but on the structure they were attempting to impose around her. The moment stretched further, suspended in a controlled stillness that felt increasingly like the calm before an unspoken decision would finally be made. The stillness that had settled over the street began to take on a heavier quality, as if the environment itself was absorbing the tension and holding it in place without release. Laura Bennett remained centered beneath the flickering streetlight, her posture unchanged, yet her awareness fully engaged with the shifting micro-patterns of movement around her. The semicircle of 6 figures maintained their positions, but the earlier sense of confident control had subtly evolved into something less certain, as if their own formation no longer felt as stable as it had been moments before. The diner behind Laura continued to reflect fragmented silhouettes of all present, its glass surface turning each movement into layered distortions that made the scene feel both real and detached at the same time. One of the men shifted his weight backward slightly, then stopped, as if reconsidering the meaning of the distance he was maintaining. Another glanced briefly toward the edge of the street, where darkness extended beyond the reach of the light, but quickly returned his attention to Laura, unwilling to break formation. Laura's gaze followed neither hesitation nor distraction, instead remaining fixed on the structure of the group as a whole, reading it as a single coordinated system rather than separate individuals. She adjusted her breathing slowly, almost imperceptibly, her shoulders remaining level, her stance balanced in a way that suggested complete control of her physical state. The streetlight above flickered again, this time with a longer delay before stabilizing, casting uneven illumination across the group and briefly obscuring facial detail before restoring clarity. In that momentary distortion, the sense of certainty in the group's formation seemed to waver, though no one explicitly moved to correct it. Laura took a slow step forward, not toward any one person in particular, but into the negative space between two of them, subtly altering the geometry of the encirclement. The shift was small, yet it forced an immediate recalibration in the spacing, causing the semicircle to expand unevenly before settling again into a new configuration. No one spoke. The silence had now transitioned from passive observation into active restraint, as if each participant was measuring the consequences of the next decision rather than preparing to act impulsively. Laura's eyes briefly lifted toward the nearest reflection in the diner window, then returned forward, her attention now anchored to both physical presence and environmental feedback simultaneously. A distant engine sound passed along the cross street, briefly increasing ambient noise before fading again into the city background, leaving the immediate space even more isolated than before. One of the men exhaled through his nose, a controlled but visible sign of tension that contrasted with the stillness he was trying to maintain. Laura did not acknowledge it. Instead, she shifted her stance once more, aligning her feet with deliberate precision, grounding herself more firmly within the space, as though preparing for a transition that had not yet fully revealed itself. The group remained intact, their formations still surrounding her, but the confidence in their containment had begun to erode at the edges, replaced by uncertainty that was not yet spoken but clearly felt. The moment stretched forward again, suspended in a delicate balance where no action had been taken, yet every possibility had already begun to change shape. The tension that had been carefully contained within the semicircle of 6 figures began to shift in a way that was no longer entirely controlled, not through any visible escalation, but through subtle breakdowns and certainty that spread through their formation like quiet interruptions in a synchronized system. Laura Bennett remained at the center of it all beneath the flickering streetlight, her posture unchanged, her attention steady, yet now fully attuned to the psychological structure of the group surrounding her. The diner window behind her continued to reflect fractured versions of the scene, each reflection slightly delayed or distorted, giving the impression that reality itself was lagging behind the unfolding moment. One of the men shifted his position slightly to the left, then hesitated, as if reconsidering whether the movement had improved or weakened their containment. Another adjusted his stance backward by a few inches, creating uneven spacing that disrupted the previously consistent arc. Laura observed these changes without reacting outwardly, her eyes moving across the group in a slow, deliberate pattern that suggested she was not just seeing individuals, but evaluating structure and intention simultaneously. The air between them felt increasingly static, as if every small movement required more effort than before, not physically, but psychologically. The streetlight flickered again, briefly dimming the center of the confrontation before returning to full brightness. sharpening the contrast of their silhouettes against the pavement. Laura's breathing remained even, controlled, and nearly imperceptible, reinforcing the sense that she was not under pressure in the same way the others appeared to be. A distant sound of a passing vehicle briefly crossed the far end of the street, its headlights cutting across the edge of the scene and then disappearing, leaving the group once again isolated in artificial light. One of the men looked toward where the vehicle had passed, then quickly returned his focus to Laura, as if embarrassed by the momentary loss of attention. Laura took a small step forward, not aggressive, not defensive, but intentional, moving into a position that subtly redefined the spacing between herself and the nearest individual. The adjustment forced the semicircle to shift again, unevenly this time, as the group compensated without verbal coordination. The sense of control they had established earlier was no longer stable, replaced by a quiet recalibration that none of them openly acknowledged. Laura's gaze briefly lowered to the pavement, tracing the faint lines of cracked concrete and scattered debris, then rose again to meet the general direction of the group without focusing on any one person. The diner's interior light flickered faintly through the glass, casting moving reflections that layered over the figures outside, making it harder to distinguish where one form ended and another began. The silence between them had evolved into something denser, less like absence of sound and more like a shared restraint, as if all participants were waiting for a signal that had not yet arrived. Laura adjusted her shoulders slightly, maintaining balance and readiness without altering her calm expression. The group remained in position, but their formation now felt less like control and more like hesitation held together by routine. No one stepped forward, and no one stepped back, yet the space between them continued to change in ways that were subtle but increasingly significant, as the moment stretched forward without resolution. The silence that had settled over the street now carried a different weight, no longer defined by anticipation alone, but by the gradual recognition that the situation had reached a point where every participant was actively recalculating their position within it. Laura Bennett stood beneath the flickering streetlight, her presence unchanged in form but increasingly central in perception, as the semicircle of 6 figures around her continued to lose the structural confidence they had initially imposed. The diner window behind her reflected the scene in fractured layers, each pane of glass capturing slightly offset versions of movement, creating a visual distortion that mirrored the psychological instability forming within the group. One of the men shifted his stance again, this time more noticeably, stepping a fraction backward before stopping himself, as if the decision to retreat even slightly carried unintended implications. Another adjusted his shoulders and turned his head briefly toward the street, scanning for external reference points that were not there, then quickly returned his attention to Laura, as if anchoring himself back into the moment. Laura did not react to these changes in a visible way. Instead, her gaze remained steady and forward, moving across the group in a measured sequence that suggested she was mapping behavioral patterns rather than simply observing individuals. The streetlight above them flickered with a longer interruption this time, dimming the entire scene for a second before stabilizing again, and in that brief absence of light, the formation appeared less certain, more fragmented, as if its cohesion depended on constant visual reinforcement. Laura's posture remained controlled, her weight evenly distributed, her breathing steady and nearly imperceptible, reinforcing the contrast between her internal stability and the increasingly unstable coordination of the group around her. A faint sound of distant traffic crossed the far end of the street, briefly introducing movement beyond the immediate perimeter before fading again, leaving the space once more isolated and contained. One of the men cleared his throat softly, then remained silent, as if reconsidering whether any sound would improve or worsen the situation. Laura took a small step forward, not abrupt, not defensive, but positioned with intent, subtly altering the spatial balance between herself and the nearest individual. The adjustment caused a ripple effect within the semicircle, forcing minor repositioning among the others, breaking the earlier symmetry that had defined their containment strategy. The diner's interior light flickered faintly through the glass behind her, layering warm reflections over the cold exterior lighting and producing a composite image of movement that was both present and fragmented. Laura's eyes briefly lowered again, not in hesitation, but in assessment, tracing the ground beneath her feet before returning to a forward focus that encompassed the entire group without isolating any single target. The men remained in place, but their formation now carried visible inconsistencies in spacing and alignment, as if the structure they had established was being maintained more by habit than certainty. No one spoke, and no one advanced, yet the space between them continued to shift in subtle but meaningful ways, as if the confrontation was being redefined not by action, but by the gradual erosion of control on one side and the quiet stability on the other. The moment stretched forward again, suspended in a state where outcome had not yet arrived, but direction had already begun to change. The tension that had been building in slow and nearly imperceptible layers now reached a point where even the smallest movements carried amplified meaning within the silent stretch of Denver Street beneath the unstable streetlight. Laura Bennett remained positioned at the center of the encounter, her stance unchanged in form but fully engaged in perception, as the semicircle of 6 figures around her struggled to maintain the structure they had established earlier. The diner behind her continued to reflect fragmented versions of the scene, each pane of glass presenting a slightly different alignment of bodies and light, creating a fractured visual echo of the shifting dynamics outside. One of the men shifted his feet again, this time more hesitantly, as if testing whether the ground beneath his decision remained stable. Another leaned slightly toward the group, then stopped, his movement interrupted mid-transition, leaving a visible imbalance in the spacing that no one immediately corrected. Laura's eyes continued to move across them in a controlled and systematic rhythm, not focusing on any one individual for long, but instead absorbing the collective structure they formed and the inconsistencies emerging within it. The streetlight above flickered again, briefly dimming the entire scene before returning with sharper intensity, casting deeper contrast across their silhouettes and momentarily exaggerating the unevenness of their formation. Laura did not adjust her posture in response to the light change, but remained steady, her breathing controlled and unbroken, reinforcing the sense that she was unaffected by the environmental instability that seemed to unsettle the others more with each passing second. A distant vehicle passed at the far edge of the street, its headlights briefly sweeping across the pavement before disappearing, leaving behind a deeper sense of isolation that seemed to compress the space between them further. One of the men lowered his gaze briefly, then lifted it again toward Laura, as if reassessing expectations that no longer matched the reality unfolding in front of him. Laura took a small step forward, subtle and deliberate, not toward confrontation, but into a position that shifted the spatial balance of the semicircle once again, forcing another minor adjustment in the group's alignment. The movement was enough to break the remaining consistency in their spacing, causing a ripple of repositioning that was no longer coordinated but reactive. The diner window behind her captured this adjustment in layered reflections, making it appear as though the group existed in multiple slightly misaligned versions of the same moment. Laura's expression remained unchanged, her focus steady, her attention fully engaged with the structure of the situation rather than any emotional signal within it. The men remained in place, but their confidence in the containment they had established earlier was no longer visible in their posture or spacing, replaced instead by subtle uncertainty that manifested in small corrections and delayed reactions. The silence between them continued, but it no longer felt static. It felt like a holding pattern before a shift that had already begun internally. Laura's stance remained grounded and stable, her presence forming a fixed point within the instability of the group as the moment stretched forward without resolution, carrying with it the quiet inevitability that control was no longer distributed evenly within the space. The stillness that had settled over the street reached a point where it no longer felt like silence, but rather a suspended state of attention shared between all participants within the dimly lit stretch of pavement outside the closed diner. Laura Bennett remained at the center of the semicircle of 6 figures, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, while the group around her continued to show subtle signs of structural instability that had not been present at the beginning of the encounter. The reflections in the diner window behind her captured the scene in fractured layers, each angle slightly misaligned, reinforcing the sense that the moment was no longer perfectly synchronized between perception and reality. One of the men shifted his position backward by a small but noticeable distance, then stopped abruptly, as if realizing that the movement had altered the group's balance more than intended. Another adjusted his stance inward, attempting to correct the spacing, but in doing so disrupted the symmetry further, creating a visible inconsistency in the semicircle that no one immediately addressed. Laura's gaze continued to move slowly across the group, not lingering on any one individual, but instead evaluating the collective structure as a single system that was gradually losing its coherence. The streetlight above flickered again, this time with a longer hesitation before stabilizing, briefly casting the entire scene into partial shadow before restoring uneven illumination across the pavement and the figures standing upon it. Laura did not react to the fluctuation in lighting, maintaining a steady physical presence that contrasted sharply with the increasingly uncertain micro-movements of those surrounding her. A faint sound of distant traffic crossed the edge of the street and faded, leaving the space once again isolated and compressed under artificial light. One of the men exhaled slowly, then shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a movement that appeared small but further disrupted the already weakening formation. Laura took another measured step forward, not directed at any single person, but positioned in a way that subtly redefined the spatial boundaries of the encounter, forcing the semicircle to adjust again in uneven increments. The adjustment was no longer synchronized. Each movement appeared delayed, as if the group was responding individually rather than as a coordinated unit. The diner window reflected this change in overlapping fragments, creating the impression of multiple slightly misaligned versions of the same confrontation occurring simultaneously. Laura's expression remained calm and controlled, her focus steady, her attention fully engaged with the structural behavior of the group rather than any emotional signal. The men remained in place, but their earlier confidence in maintaining control of the situation had visibly eroded, replaced by hesitation that manifested in small corrections, delayed reactions, and inconsistent spacing. No one spoke, and no one advanced. Yet the psychological structure of the encounter had clearly shifted, as if the balance of control had quietly moved away from the formation and toward the single steady presence at its center. The silence continued, but it was no longer uniform. It had become uneven, filled with pauses that suggested internal reassessment rather than unified intent, as the moment stretched forward without resolution but no longer without change. The final stretch of silence on the street outside the closed diner had become something heavier than anticipation, something closer to inevitability unfolding at a controlled pace. Laura Bennett remained at the center of the semicircle of 6 figures, her posture unchanged, her composure steady, while the group around her had now fully transitioned from coordinated containment into fragmented hesitation. The reflections in the diner window behind her showed layered distortions of all participants, as if the scene itself could no longer maintain a single stable interpretation of what was happening. One of the men shifted backward again, this time more decisively, breaking the near symmetry that had once defined the semicircle and creating a visible gap that none of the others immediately corrected. Another attempted to step inward to compensate, but his movement came too late, resulting in uneven spacing that exposed a loss of collective confidence. Laura observed these adjustments without interruption, her gaze moving with calm precision across the group, registering the breakdown in their formation as a structural change rather than an emotional reaction. The streetlight above flickered once more, but this time the interruption felt less disruptive and more symbolic, as if the environment itself was acknowledging the shift that had already taken place. Laura's stance remained grounded, her weight balanced, her breathing steady, reinforcing a presence that did not fluctuate even as the group around her struggled to maintain consistency. A distant sound of traffic passed briefly along the far edge of the street and faded, leaving the space once again enclosed in artificial light and controlled silence. One of the men lowered his head slightly, then raised it again, as if recalibrating his understanding of the situation in real time. Laura took a final measured step forward, not toward confrontation, but into the center of the spatial imbalance that had formed, and that movement alone caused the semicircle to lose its remaining coherence entirely. The group no longer appeared unified in intent. Instead, each individual seemed to be operating within separate thresholds of hesitation, creating a fractured formation that could no longer sustain its original structure. The diner window behind her reflected this dissolution in overlapping fragments, each reflection slightly misaligned, emphasizing the breakdown of uniform perception. Laura's expression remained unchanged, her focus steady, her attention fully encompassing the entire group without prioritizing any single individual. No one spoke, and no one advanced, and yet the situation had clearly reached its conclusion in all but formal acknowledgement. The men remained in place, but their posture no longer suggested control, only awareness of a shift that had already occurred beyond their ability to reverse. The silence that followed was no longer tension waiting to break, but resolution settling into place, as the street outside the diner returned to stillness under the flickering light, now fully defined by the absence of resistance and the quiet certainty of outcome.